the number of people joining is climbing, which is great to see. So I think we'll start very shortly. Arna, could you are you recording?
Yeah, recording.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Hi, Albrecht.
Hey, good to see you and good to see everybody. Welcome.
Yes, welcome everyone. So this is the Pearson Business Book Club. My name is Eloise Cook and I'm the publisher for the professional business lists at Pearson. Each month at the book club, we choose a Pearson business or personal development book and we invite the author or authors on to discuss it. And they'll also be giving a masterclass on a key concept from the book. So we're recording this, and if you need to leave halfway through, the video will be available to watch on demand at the book club website. So, the exciting stuff. Today's book, our book of the month, is Solvable by Arnaud Chevalier and Albrecht Enders. So Arnaud couldn't make it today, unfortunately, but I'm super delighted that Albrecht will be joining us as well. If you haven't got a copy yet, you can download a sample chapter of the book from the book club webpage. And we also want you to use the Q&A function if you have any questions, and we'll get Albrecht to answer these at the end. So I'm going to give a quick introduction. So Albrecht Enders is Professor of Strategy and Innovation and Dean of Programs and Innovation at IMD Business School in Switzerland. His major research, teaching and consulting interests are in the areas of managing discontinuous change, I might have to ask you about that in a minute, and top team strategy development processes. And I'll also give a little bio for Arnaud. He's not here, but as co-author. He is also Professor of Strategy at IMD. He prepares executives for the strategic challenges that corporations face in today's dynamic global marketplace by helping them make better decisions in volatile and uncertain conditions. He directs the Global Management Foundations and the Foundation Stage Singapore programs that are part of the IMD EMBA curriculum. Gosh, we've got a lot of letters there, which is exciting. So welcome, Albrecht. Thank you so much for doing this. How are you?
Thank you for having me. Great. Still enjoying the Swiss sun here, so hopefully you can see me okay.
Yes. I was thinking this might be our first sort of international author book club event, so this is very exciting.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start with our usual questions. Just to sort of about the book and the process. So can you tell us, why did you want to write this book?
So that goes back actually quite a long time. I was with Boston Consulting Group over 20 years ago, and I was doing lots of projects and for insurance and energy companies and different other industries, and I always liked the content of the projects, but what I was even more interested in was the underlying process that we use to approach these projects. And I've been thinking about that ever since, and I've been teaching complex problem solving and also strategy over the last 20 years in different places, for undergraduates, for graduates, and then more recently over the last 15 years now as well, here at IMD, working with executives. And that was kind of what prompted my thinking. And then Arnaud joined us a few years back from Rice University from the US. And then he and I sat down and said, look, we got to get this stuff on paper. And it took us a few years, but then we finally managed, and we're very happy with it.
Yes, as we are too. And problem solving always comes up as a top skill that people will need now and in the future. So yes, it's fantastic to have this book on the Pearson list. So second question, what surprised you about writing this book?
So what I find really fascinating more is that that I can now come into programs here at IMD, and participants have read the book already, and to just see conceptually where they are and the types of conversations we can start having, because they have basically the background, the foundation, and then to really be able to build on that. I guess I continue to be surprised and then also fascinated by how much knowledge you can share by actually writing a book, and how much more leverage that gives you versus just doing everything in the classroom, which is what I used to do in the past.
Oh, well, that's good to hear, because yes, that's something I encourage authors to do. You know, given your knowledge of the
Yeah,
classroom, how might you incorporate that into the book, so you know people can have the experience even though you're not there in
yeah,
person.
exactly.
That's great. And finally, how do you want readers to feel about reading your book?
So I was, yeah, like feeling. I was thinking about the word feeling, and I guess what I would hope for, what I'd look for, is a feeling of connection. That Solvable helps them to connect the dots, from a process perspective, that it takes them from the beginning to the end of a problem solving process. It's kind of like I like to think about it as an operating system. You know, when I used to teach strategy, there are a lot of different frameworks, but there was no operating system that would actually help you to connect these different frameworks. And what we try to develop with Solvo was actually a systematic process. And then whether it's Porter's 5 forces or business model, Canvas, or other the 4 Ps of marketing, you know, whatever type of framework that you might have that kind of sits alone, you can use to kind of amplify within the structure within our solvable process, and thereby really help you to get from A to B. So that's one element. Then also this notion of analytical, rational, and emotional engagement piece. You know, that it's both. It's not just about doing an analysis, but it's also not just about getting out and engaging with people. That you need to do both, and that it's also about top down and bottom up. How do you integrate that? So this feeling of integration, connecting the dots, if that's something that people take away from reading the book, would make me very happy, and Arnaud as well.
Yes, fantastic. Right, well, I'm going to hand over to you for the masterclass. As a reminder, if anyone has any questions, please use the Q&A function, and we'll come to them afterwards. So take it away.
Yes, let me just see if I can get my slides up.
Yes, this is always the tricky part, isn't it? Here we go.
Hopefully we should be able to pull that off after all. Voila, is that any good?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Super. So what I'd like to do is really 3 things. To kind of set the stage, I'd like to talk a little bit about how I think about strategy, because that's where I come from. I'm a professor of strategy, and then I like to link that back to the 3-step process that we developed in Solvable, and then kind of lay out the 3 different steps, not necessarily in sequence, but you know, kind of build up to the key messages. And then maybe also have a little bit of a conversation with you about how you can actually use this process for your business challenges that you might be facing. And yes, please do ask questions. Hopefully we will have some time at the end to actually also have a little bit of a discussion, which should make this more fun and more insightful. So that's the plan. And let me start out with the way I introduce my strategy classes. And I really have a simple chart where I say, look, there are basically 3 words when you discuss and talk about strategy. And if these 3 words don't appear somewhere in your discussion with your team, with your executive board, you're probably not discussing strategy, at least the way I like to think about it. And these 3 words that are absolutely critical to strategic decision making is a notion about anticipation, that you're kind of looking into the future, that you need to anticipate and make some calls about what is the world going to look like, and make sense of these changes, and that you're not just winging, but that you're actually making clear decisions based on that anticipation. And then there's a second key point, which is all about finding leverage points, determining within the context that you're operating in, where can specific activities actually make a disproportionate impact, where you make a certain type of investment over here, and then you get a much larger return on that investment somewhere else. So really trying to understand what the problem, what the challenge is about, and then figuring out, based on where you're coming from as an organization, where you can have the most impact. And then the last point, and that is really a critically important point in the context of Solvable as well, figuring out where do we actually put our scarce resources, behind which leverage points, so that we can actually make or have a real visible effect to our actions, and ask the key question there: where do you concentrate your limited energy and resources, which means that you'll be saying no probably to most ideas, most initiatives that are being brought to you by your colleagues, by your peers, by your employees, also by the ideas that you might have floating in your head. And you'll be only saying yes to a very select few ideas. And the way we conceptualize this idea of saying yes and no is that notion of a fork in the road. And if you go back in time and think back to when you took on your first job, it's that kind of a fork in the road that you faced, where you said, look, I go and work for this and that consulting firm. I can also become somebody who does something independently or work for the government or whatever else. But the key point is that at least in most cases, when you graduate from university, you're not going to take on 25 different jobs, but you need to pick one, because that's the way work life is most typically organized. It's changing, but at least for most of us, this probably was the case. And then at some point, with this fork in the road, you might see that your friend from university is doing something on the left that's much more interesting than what you're doing on the right. And given how this fork in the road is structured, you might actually say, look, after 6 months, I'm actually changing direction. And then you move over and do something differently. So you had this notion of a fork in the road, but it wasn't quite as limiting and quite as focusing as it might be today. If you're like, at my age now, I'm 50, I have 3 kids, a wife, a house, a lot of things that are locked in, where it's much more complex and much more difficult to actually make these big life moves. And for me, these forks in the road look much more like this. Now, this is actually a picture here that's similar to the Swiss Alps where we live, and actually tell the story of how we often find ourselves at these forks in the road when we are taking hikes in the mountains with the family and the 3 kids who by now have grown up, but were many times with us at these forks of the road. And then the default was always to say, look, why don't we go back to the parking lot on the left? It's just another 20 minutes and we get to go home and play Fortnite and check Instagram and have some ice cream. And then I always had this notion of saying, but there's this exciting mountain peak that I'd like you to come to with us. And it's going to be a lot of fun. But obviously, as you can see, it's not super easy to get up there. And that's then my challenge as a family person. And I'm sure that some of you might face these same challenges as well. But it's also a challenge that we face as leaders in organization, where we have some kind of a direction that we might have worked out, but it's not just about figuring out direction, but it's also about actually energizing the teams that work for you, that they want to come up to that mountaintop with you, versus just kind of continuing on the path that they've always been on, or just, as has happened oftentimes in the case of my family, just staying at this fork in the road and discussing and debating for an hour, and then time ran out and we actually had to go back. So it's this notion of direction and energizing that's critically important for a leader. Actually, from our perspective, the kind of 2 core elements. And you already see that in an organizational context, there is a tension between these 2 things, because if you provide direction, by definition, you're going to be saying no to a lot of things. And if you say no to a lot of things, you're also going to be saying no to people who come with these ideas to you. And typically, if you say no, that's not something that's terribly exciting. And we capture this with this little matrix here, where you have on the one axis, on the y-axis, this notion of direction, defining mission, vision, providing clear direction, making the difficult trade-off decisions, and then driving accountability. And then there's also a second axis that's all about energizing, listening and engaging, seeking out input, and also showing your own vulnerabilities, that you don't have all the answers yourself. And then if you look at the three core quadrants of this matrix, you see that probably for many or most of you, who have had successful careers in your organizations, this this bucket of diffusion of effort, where you're just energizing without providing direction, is probably not the biggest issue. But many of you might find yourself either as leader or somebody who's being led in this quadrant of lacking engagement, where you're getting a lot of direction, but you're not having the sense that you're actually getting energy from your boss, that your boss is not necessarily listening and engaging, seeking out input, and showing showing their own vulnerabilities to actually motivate you and entice you to be engaged. And then, as we had with the fork in the road, the issue is you might have that direction, but you don't have energizing. You won't be able to get to that sustained high organizational performance quadrant on the right. So there is some kind of an inherent tension of polarity between engagement and energizing. I want to talk about that in a little bit more detail later on, but it also points to a more fundamental challenge that we face as leaders, that is of managing polarities overall, where you have this tension between short-term, long-term, emotional, rational, chaos, order, and so on. And the job of the leader is to actually figure out these tensions, work with these tensions in constructive ways, to then both provide the direction within these tensions. We visualize it as a trampoline, but then also to energize. And one of the key jobs in order to actually identify these tensions and manage them is to actually simplify the world. And the metaphor, the picture that I use for expressing that is here a picture of London. That's what we face as managers when we look at the world. It's a huge amount of complexity, huge amount of information that we are absorbing. And if we just pass that huge complexity on to our teams and work with that complexity at all moments, we'd be overwhelmed. It's a lot of fun, and it's great to be looking at that picture and get a sense of what's going on in London during the day and at night. But if you want to take the tube from one place to another, for instance, from Tottenham Court Road to whatever here, Baker Street, or if you want to walk from James Park to London Bridge, it's not useful to have a picture with all the details. Instead, what you need to have is some kind of an abstract map that focuses on everything that's important, but leaves everything that's not relevant and not important out, so that you only focus your team on those things that matter. Obviously, that's something that's debatable, because if you come up with a tube map and you actually want to walk, the map is still not going to be very helpful. So you want to also have some kind of discussion about which map you want to use. But unless you have some kind of a map that breaks down the complexity of the challenge that you're facing into something that's simpler and more focused on the key issues at hand, the likelihood that you get from point A to point B is actually much lower than if you have that kind of a map. And when it comes to this notion of the fork in the road, the one tool that we found to be extremely helpful to have managers work out what the tensions are, what's pulling you into different directions, is actually a simple decision matrix, which we talk about quite a bit in the book, where you map out your options and your criteria on these two axes, and then go about evaluating the different benefits and drawbacks of these options. And there are, going back again to this notion of direction and energizing, there are a few points that a matrix gives you above and beyond the things that you might typically think about. So first of all, it gives you direction by ranking different options according to pre-established criteria in a transparent manner. So the point that we want to make here is that it actually helps you to step back and disconnect the deciding from the framing, where you first get all the material out and only then decide. And the second one is that you don't just say yes to something, but you also very explicitly say no to other potential ways of pursuing the same kind of goal that you might have. And that's critically important, that you not just say yes, but you're also saying no, or you're also saying at least not now. And that's really the only way how you can get that in a systematic way, is by using that kind of a tool. And then the second point relates back to the energizing aspect. And the other key point is that the matrix actually helps you to integrate the perspectives of multiple different stakeholders, both with regards to what kind of options they might desire, and also which criteria might be relevant to them. So you want to make sure when you create this matrix that you're not just doing that on your own, but that you're talking to those stakeholders, first of all, that might have interesting and relevant perspectives, point A, and you also want to integrate those stakeholders that you need later on when you actually need to implement the initiative that you have in mind. Because these people need to be somehow brought on board, especially if you say no to what they have proposed, and you end up pursuing another plan of action. And what the matrix, and that takes me to the second point, what the matrix allows you to do is that you can carefully debate and discuss that you've thought through the trade-offs that come with different options, because you've actually looked at the different criteria that come with different options. So whether it's not just about costs, not just about revenues, but there might also be something about link with the company, cultural values, whatever it is that matters to the organization. You can integrate these perspectives into the matrix, and overall, what you hopefully will be able to do, and that's in the end one of the key points how you can manage the tension or the polarity that we talked about early on, between directing and energizing, is that if you actually have done a good job at developing this matrix, you can say no to people, and you're able to explain the why you made that decision, why there might be certain downsides to the option that you chose, why there might also be certain upsides to the options that your colleagues preferred, and why, on balance, you believe that your way forward is the most promising way to do so, or most promising way forward. And with the hope that by doing so, you create a sense of fair process or procedural fairness, as we call it. So that when the folks listening to you, step back, that they say, look, I might not agree with what you've come up with, but what I do sense is that you have listened to me, and you've taken my perspectives into consideration when you made your decision. And that's something that I want to honor. That's something that I respect. And because of that, I feel treated fairly, and because of feeling treated fairly, I'm actually willing to come along. Versus you just walking out into the team saying, look, this is what you're doing, getting pushback, you saying, well, I guess I haven't thought about that, but now it's too late, and it's either my way or the highway, which is probably much less energizing than if you're actually able to reflect the perspectives from the different stakeholders. And basically what we're saying is that this matrix is a comprehensive tool to cover these, both the content perspectives, but also the energizing perspectives. And that if you do it well, you're not just coming up with a better solution, but you're also much better positioned to actually have good conversations with your team and thereby engage them. So that's one aspect about the matrix, and then there's actually a second point. When you've done a good matrix and then made a good on balance decision, it also opens up different types of possibilities, how you might go into communication situations where you actually might be standing in front of 100, 200 people of your organization and need to tell them why you made, or what decision you made and why you made it. So you have here the alternatives and the criterion, the objectives. In the most obvious case, you might just say, look, if you don't expect any pushback, you just say, look, this is the alternative that we want to pursue, and here are the reasons. And that's fine if there's no debate, if there's no controversial sentiment in the organization. That's fine to do it like that. However, when you actually expect people to have different opinions, having done a good matrix actually also opens up the opportunity to say, look, this has been a tough decision for us to make. We looked at a range of different alternatives. We thought about, selling off. We thought about integrating. We thought about mergers and acquisitions. And you know what? There was no obvious solution. And hopefully by doing that, you already showed to the folks in the room that you've been broad and comprehensive in your thinking, that you've taken their perspectives into account. And then you can actually go into more detail into the specific options that you've chosen, hopefully with much more buy-in and much more credibility than if you just kind of jump in and just go straight for the option that you've picked out. And then if it's even more controversial, you can also say, look, you start with the objectives and say, look, we need to, on the one hand, think from a long-term perspective, how do we make this this company successful? And at the same time, we also need to make sure that we survive on a short-term basis. Or you might say, look, we obviously want to make all of our employees, or we want to create a good work climate here, and we want to make our employees happy. And at the same time, we also have external stakeholders, in particular our shareholders, that have some different demands, or that they're also looking for more immediate financial payoffs. So that's a tension that we need to manage here as a management team. And the moment you actually get the buy-in from your audience, that the tension that you need to manage, that this polarity is something where there's no obvious solution to, again, this will make it much easier for you to then actually go into the conversation and then the presentation about which are the best alternatives, and which one actually makes, on balance, the most sense, satisfying most of the demands from your different stakeholders. And the point here is that, and maybe also something that we can discuss later on, is basically what I argue is that unless you've gone through some kind of an exercise where you've considered different options, where you've considered different criteria, different objectives that different people might have, and where you've thought about some kind of trade-offs and unbalanced solutions, you won't be able to have that kind of a conversation. So that's a really important benefit of actually doing that matrix thinking. One pushback that we oftentimes get is that people say, look, I went through this matrix exercise, and it looked academically really good, but some of the discussions that we were having in the team were about really different topics, and somehow the matrix got pushed to the side because the issues that we actually debated weren't actually reflected in the matrix, and that's why they think the tool isn't any good. And what I respond to there is that, yes, that's a very fair point. It can happen, and it's unfortunate. But there's also a way how you can kind of alleviate, I wouldn't say completely eliminate this issue, but how you can make it less likely to show up and less likely to be a problem. And the way to do that is to actually sit down and just talk about different alternatives, for instance, the alternative that you prefer and the alternative that your colleagues prefer, in a qualitative way, where you just have a discussion about, why do I like what I want to do? Because it's much less expensive, it's because it's less risky, because it's going to be easier to get past the units, where you just basically write down the pros that you're discussing, when you're having this debate about different options. And same thing obviously about the negative aspects, and do the same thing about your colleagues' preferred alternative. So you take the qualitative assessment, the discussion, write that down, capture it, and then abstract out of it and try to actually figure out what are the most salient criteria that we can actually kind of isolate from that big long conversation that we can then stick into the matrix. So it kind of flips the process on its head, that you're not starting with the matrix and then somehow hope that it fits the conversation, but you start with the conversation and say, well, it's good to have that because it helps us to capture the richness. It's kind of like, having a picture of London. But then at some point you say, in order for us to manage this, we actually need to step out and actually define what the relevant and most salient criteria are that we can then use to work within the matrix. So that's one way of sidestepping the criticism that we often hear, that the matrix actually doesn't capture the key points. And then one last point, no, not the last point, actually a couple last points, is you can also use the matrix thinking in different ways. There's obviously the elaborate process where we talk about that also in more length when I lay out the whole structure of our problem solving process. But the basic idea is that you go through a lot of effort creating some kind of a spreadsheet, some kind of a structure, use our app to lay out options, to lay out criteria, to weigh criteria as well, to come up with, in quotes, the right solution. And that's good and valuable, but it's obviously only something that you'll use in very selected situation and contexts for really important challenges that you might be facing, where actually it's worthwhile to go through the whole effort of making that kind of a structure. What we've also found, though, is that actually, going through the process that we lay out in Solvable, and then kind of witnessing what our participants are doing with it, after you've done it a couple of times, this matrix thinking, for instance, gives you also a simple mental checklist of alternatives, criteria, and trade-offs that you can use in any type of conversation that you're having, where there's some kind of a debate about which way to go forward, or what the right solution is. And so this might be in a business meeting, this might be a debate over lunch, where you just invoke mentally the notion of the matrix when you find yourself getting stuck and you proposing one way forward and a colleague proposing another way forward. That actually helps you to step back. Where you just say, what's the matrix? Where you ask yourself, what actually the criteria? Did we consider all criteria? Did we consider all relevant alternatives? What are we trading off? Okay, so we basically step back and create that framing for yourself and try to understand where your colleague is coming from before you actually start jumping into any type of decision. And it has a really significant effect on how you go about the conversation that you're having. So instead of defending your solution, you actually step back and you actually try to understand, so what's actually important to you? What are your objectives, and what comes first and what comes second? Is revenue more important to you than profitability? Is long-term more important to you than short-term? What do actually the different alternatives mean? Do we really have a clear picture about what you want and what I want? And then to also have a debate about, what are we actually trading off here? And what on balance might make most sense. So it really helps you to step back with a simple mental checklist to refocus your conversations. And then if things go well, actually going through this exercise of mapping out the tensions of your matrix might also help you to actually come up with new solutions that you actually haven't thought of, because you actually are able to clearly identify the tensions that you're facing and the trade-offs that you're facing with different types of alternatives, and to then say, well, maybe there is a third or fourth alternative that we haven't thought of and discussed yet, but because we are so clear about what the tensions are that we are facing, we actually have that opportunity do that now. And to illustrate that, I just want to mention a really nice example from Germany that kind of captures the essence of this notion of integrative thinking, as Roger Martin, the professor who came up with that idea, calls it. And it's a story about an engineer working at BMW sometime in the 80s, I suppose. And he had this type of a 3 Series BMW, wonderful sportive car, and he wanted to take his family, his wife and his 2 kids, and strollers and tricycles and bicycles on the vacation. He basically faced the fork in the road decision of taking this BMW and leaving his family at home, versus actually taking a VW Passat where he'd be able to store all his things. And the interesting thing is that he noticed these tensions between the two different ways forward. And instead of going for one fork in the road or the other fork in the road, he just said, look, maybe there's something else I could do. And he just chopped off the back of an old traditional 3 Series BMW and installed his own back. And then before actually going on vacation, he thought he should check with his boss at the headquarters, showed him the car. And they looked at it and they said, this car is not leaving the parking lot anymore. And actually became the inspiration for BMW to launch the 3 Series Touring, which, at least in Germany now, is one of the most successful cars. So the point is that once you've identified the tensions that you're facing that come with different alternatives, it might also be a really interesting launch pad to actually come up with new and different ideas. And the point that we make in the book is that unless you're clear about the tensions and the polarities that come with different existing alternatives, you're not so well set up to actually come up with new options or new alternatives that transcend and might dissolve the tensions that you are facing. So that's a little bit about this notion of deciding, getting to the forks in the road in your decision making, and then working out where do you go from there. And that's where many of the conversations actually start that we have in strategy, where we find ourselves at a fork in the road. And that's obviously a critically important step. But then in Solvable, we actually said there's more to the problem solving process than just managing the forks in the road. You actually need to figure out what is my challenge actually, what's the framing of my challenge. And then you also need to think systematically about coming up with different ideas, how you could potentially do that. And that takes us to the overall framework that we use in Solvable, which consists of 3 steps, which are frame, explore, and decide. We call them abbreviated FRED. And they're all about defining your problem as completely as needed, but as simply as possible, which is similar to the point about the picture of London. Understanding root causes and stating one key question. It's about exploring what could you do to address the problem. So kind of being expansive in your thinking about potential solution spaces and organizing potential alternatives. And then step 3, which we just discussed now at length, think about what do your stakeholders want, working through the trade-offs, and then choosing the most compelling alternative. And then throughout the process, as hopefully I made clear at the beginning with the picture, it's not just about this analytic process of framing, exploring, and deciding, but throughout that entire process, it's also about how to actually engage with my important stakeholders, both to get the ideas that helps me to inform that process, but then also to energize them in a way that they will want to help me later on to actually execute on the decision that we made. What I want to do now for the last few minutes is to just dive a little bit into these 2 other steps and show you some of the key tools that we are using there. And then obviously, hopefully, you also have a chance to go into more detail with these different elements when you go through the book. So let's look at this whole notion of framing first. And the challenge of framing is, or the importance of framing again is twofold. It's for you to actually figure out, what do I focus on? Do I need a tube map, or do I need a street map or a bus map in order to address the challenge? And then equally importantly, it's also important when you actually go out into a communication situation where you need to present, because you're not just jumping in saying, look, this is a solution that I have, where nobody actually understands what the challenge is. But you need to also provide the relevant context so that the audience that's listening to actually knows, well, what are we actually talking about? And the way we've approached this this framing topic is actually by taking some advice from storytelling, and basically where we say, look, any story, whether it's Star Wars or The Silence of the Lamb, has some kind of a background, has some kind of a rising action where things get complicated, and then there's a climax where really kind of everything comes together. And the three elements that we introduce in Solvable are the elements of a hero and a treasure, where there is some kind of a person or a team that has some kind of an objective, wants to go somewhere, wants to increase revenues, or wants to prevent, profitability from falling, or wants to introduce a new product, or whatever else it might be. And then we say any good problem doesn't just have a goal, but it also has some kind of an obstacle. We call that a dragon. There's a dragon between me, my team, and the treasure. And then the final point of that introduction is a quest, where we say, how do we actually achieve that treasure, given that there's something in the way? And what we've seen is we can basically structure any type of challenge by focusing on these elements, by drilling on the core, on these core elements, and by focusing your framing on these elements. That it's not a 50-page presentation where you talk about, everything and nothing, but where you really focus in on these three core elements in a way that helps you to zoom in on the most critical issues. And that's we like to summarize this with this kind of circle that captures the whole universe of potential problems that I could address. And basically what you do with this hero, treasure, dragon, quest sequence is you say, look, out of the universe, I say, look, I'm not focusing right now on profitability. I'm not focusing on cost. I'm focusing, I don't know what, on the happiness of my family, for instance. That's my goal. And then there are a million obstacles that I could focus on, that I don't have enough money, that I'm working too much, or whatever else. And I pick out not all these different obstacles, because different obstacles might require then different types of solutions, but I select something that is most relevant in the context that I'm thinking about. And that then gives me this intersection between a specific treasure and a specific dragon, which then helps us to say, this is what we're going to focus on. And we found that to be extremely helpful, both when it comes to the problem solution process, because it actually helps you to focus, or the problem solving on something specific versus, looking at everything and nothing. And equally importantly, we found it to be very helpful to use that kind of a structure when we actually need to go out and communicate to the teams who are working with us. So that hero, treasure, dragon, quest sequence is something that we talk at length about in the early chapters of the book, explaining how you can do that, showing different examples from different industries, and discussing why, how it's done and why it's useful in many different contexts. So much for the framing. And then there's also this whole element of exploring, actually not just jumping to solutions, taking the first kind of solution that comes to your mind when you've completed your frame, but actually going more broadly. And there are different ways of doing this. You could just sit down and write up a list of different ways of, how you can manage your work-life balance in a more intelligent way. And that's fine. But there's also another way how to do that we like to apply, and that we make our participants work with, which are these how maps, as we call them. We basically try to push option spaces in a systematic manner, and create these mental buckets that help us to think much more broadly than we otherwise might be. So this notion of structured how maps is something that's central to the book. And we don't say there's one right way of doing it, whether it's organized or unorganized, but the point that we are making is that you want to know these different ways of doing it, and you want to be able to move back and forth seamlessly in order to push your option spaces or alternative spaces. And there's one example that I'd like to show you where we basically asked our participants to say, look, how could you go from London to New York by using this type of a map? And they might say, look, there's something about traveling by air, there's something about traveling by sea. If I travel by air, I can go by plane, by helicopter, by balloon, by rocket. So a bunch of really good ideas. You keep digging deeper into it and you actually get to specific flights. Or you could say, well, look, I could also travel by sea, and then if I travel by sea, I could travel on the sea surface, and you could also travel below the sea surface. So what we always try to do with these maps is to create structures that are mutually exclusive, so that there are different ways above and below, for instance, and also collectively exhaustive, so that all different alternatives are covered. And that's a great list of different ways of doing it. But once you actually get this out, you might also say, look, maybe there's also different ways of cutting this map. And I could, for instance, say, there's a conventional way of traveling, or there's an unconventional way of traveling. If I travel in an unconventional way, I could travel by land, I could do teletravel. And the point is that by making these maps, hopefully you'll be thinking much more broadly than you'll be thinking if you just made that list, and you'll be also able to manipulate these lists and change them in a much more systematic way. So that's the second point about exploring options, where you're making extensive use of these maps, and we explain also in the book in a lot of detail how to go about making these maps in an intelligent way that helps you to be more broad in your thinking. And that kind of takes me to the wrap-up slide here, to the last couple of wrap-up slides, where we basically say, look, when you think about different problem-solving methodologies, you have on the left-hand extreme, you have your gut level and your managerial experience, which is obviously a great and important thing. And then on the far right, you have complex problem-solving tools that allow you to do a lot of different things, but they might also take a lot of time and a lot of effort to actually implement, and then we rarely see them actually being used in boardroom discussions, for instance. So you see these two kind of opposed trajectories where the systematic insight obviously goes up the more tools you use, but at the same time effort and time goes up. And the pitch that we make in Solvable essentially is that by using the frame, explore, decide process, we have a sweet spot where on the one hand, it provides you with more systematic insights than you would get if you're just relying on your gut level, especially when you're working on challenges that are new and different, where your gut level, where your intuition might not be so usable and suitable. But on the other hand, it's something that's relatively easy to use. And we have an app that we lay out in the book, but you can really go through all of these steps also on the back of a napkin, and hopefully get much more insights than if you're just using your intuition. So when you're balancing effort and time and systematic insight, our pitch to you is that this process gives you a nice combination of both of these objectives that you might have. I'm mindful of time. We have 10 minutes left. I would like to kind of leave it there, encourage you to take a look at the book, and now see if there are any questions, and hopefully I'll be able to answer them. So I'll stop sharing, and Eloise, maybe you can manage the Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much. That was really interesting, and I've made a few notes myself. I really appreciate you walking us through the framework there. So yes, if you have any questions, just pop them in the Q&A. We've got a few coming in, so I'm going to fire away now. really interesting presentation. I don't have any specific questions, but I did like the idea of the direction energized matrix and how that maps to engagement, which is a hot topic at the moment. Thank you. Oh,
Yes. So I mean, like again, maybe for also something for you to comment on. You know, this notion of like basically what we're saying, the two key jobs of the leader in an organization is to work out which way to head, not necessarily by coming up with ideas by herself or himself, but by you know, sorting through ideas, but secondly also to take people along and creating that sense of fair process seems to be something that's critically important in that context. So thank you. Yes. Other thoughts?
And here's another one. How do you decide what are the most important factors to consider when looking at criteria for a decision matrix?
So that's you know, it's a super good question, and it actually it becomes you know, like a recursive loop, because you could technically make a matrix. You could use another set of criteria to decide which criteria are actually the most important one, and then you can kind of keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper without ever getting to an end, because you can always keep asking why. What are the criteria for deciding between those things? So you know, as a practicing manager, at some point you just need to say stop and say, look, who are my most important stakeholders who actually have responsibility for that, for this initiative? You know, whether it's the management team, whether it's the board, and to then have a conversation, what matters to those people. And they, in a way, define the priority, but at the same time, you want to then also be excluding or including the objectives of other stakeholders as well, who might be less important, but you want to be able to explain the trade-offs to those stakeholders so that they feel heard. That you don't just say, well, the top team said this, that's why, but you say, look, you know, we see the tension. There is something about, you know, the unions, there's something about, you know, the social contract that we have, and at the same time, what's most important to the management team at this stage is that the company survives. And that's what drove our decision making. And then if people buy it or not, you know, that's a second question, but at least you want to be able to explain where you're coming from. And having a sense about what comes first and what comes second, and not just saying, look, everything is important, is at least an interesting thing to think about.
Great. Here's another one. What is recommended when there is no debate on what and where is the problem and what should be done? For example, when a team accepts everything but express helplessness to settle with non-ideal workaround in the given context and available resources.
So the people aren't pushing back openly.
Yes,
so
I
basically
think so.
They're just kind of going along.
Yeah.
Well, I would probably I mean, I think there are probably like a whole lot of other issues that you might want to look at from just an organizational culture perspective. But I would probably let them step back and articulate their own perspectives first, and have them put stuff on paper, have them debate things amongst them before kind of imposing your view on them, just to get a sense of where they're coming from, whether they're actually genuinely agreeing with you, or whether they're just not voicing their dissenting opinions. And that really is a process management question then.
Sure, yeah, that does sound like a lack of engagement for sure.
Yes. Yeah.
And here's another one. Are there any tools we can use to generate ideas or solutions to problems? So any other tips or suggestions? So
I think in chapter 6 or 7 we talk about that at length. You know, so and basically we structure it as like top-down processes and bottom-up processes, and then the top-down process being the, you know, using the maps and using different types of cuts for these maps as well. So we, for instance, worked once for a big paper manufacturer, and they made these maps according to the different physical components of their trees, where there's like a bark and there's like big pieces of wood and small pieces of wood and there's rind. And then that thinking about the physical structure of the tree actually also drove their thinking about what to do with it, and drove actually the structure of their business units around paper, renewable materials, and building construction. And then they actually had a new person coming in who was not a traditional forest person, but was a biochemist. And that person didn't look at the tree in terms of its physical components, but looked at the tree in terms of its chemical components. And they did a structured map with these chemical components in a way, and that then led to a whole new set of applications around biomaterials, where they are now making, you know, plastic bottles, shirts, additives for paint and for medication using the different chemical components. So these maps help to kind of challenge the way you structure the world and how you come up with ideas and options. And then there are obviously also a lot of bottom-up ways of doing that, where, you know, obviously the laundry list is a really simple one, but there are a number of other techniques that we discuss in the book, that, like analogies, for instance, that you can use to kind of jumpstart your thinking about developing more creative ideas.
Fantastic. Great. Right. Well, I think that's it for the questions. So I'm just going to share my screen again, just in case people want to stay in touch with you and Arno. We've got some of your social media details here. So, you know, if you want to get in touch, I'm offering on your behalf. If anyone wants to get in touch and connect, please do. I'm sure they'd be lovely to hear from you. And
yes, reach out, but send. I'm getting lots of requests. Please add a message that you're part of the webinar, and not just sending out some random request. And I'm always happy to connect. Yes,
the password is book club.
Yeah.
Right, and thank you so much. Thank you to everyone attending, and for those watching on demand. I've had a question in the chat. This video will be available on the book club website, so we'll post that in the next few days. And I hope you'll be tuning into our next session. We're running it a week earlier than normal because of the holidays. So it will be on Tuesday, the 13th of December at 2 p.m. UK time. And our book of the month will be F Work, Let's Play by John Williams, and his masterclass will be on how to do what you love and get paid for it. So hopefully that will be something nice for everyone to sort of go off onto their holidays if they're having them. So please sign up for our mailing list, and we hope to see you next time.
Sounds like some forks in the road there as well.
yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Albrecht, and yeah, really useful. Thank you.
Goodbye.